Good evening, and welcome to the final event in the American Antiquarian Society's Fall Public Program Series, virtually, of course. My name is Scott Casper, and I'm the president of the American Antiquarian Society. For those of you who have joined us for public programs before, either in person or virtually, thank you for joining us again. For those who are new to our programs, we are happy to welcome you to join us. As we do likely have some people here who are new to us, let me quickly introduce the American Antiquarian Society. We are a national research library of American history and culture, whose mission is to collect, preserve, and share the printed record of what is now the United States, portions of Canada, and the British West Indies before the 20th century. In doing so, we collect anything and everything printed within these parameters, from graphic prints and ephemera to newspapers and periodicals to pamphlets and books. We use these collections as the basis for all of our programs, such as this one. We also have thousands of manuscript collections, including the American Antiquarian Society's own archives, which reach back to our founding in 1812. Tonight's program exemplifies a hallmark of the American Antiquarian Society, the collaboration between scholars such as Ben Mutschler, who work with our collections, and our superb curators, such as Ashley Cataldo, curator of manuscripts. From my own experience as a researcher here over many years, I can attest firsthand to the value and the power of that collaborative work. We truly are a learning community as well as a learned society. Welcome to our AAS community. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Kayla Hopper, AAS Director of Outreach, who'll say a bit about the format for tonight's program. Welcome and enjoy.
All right, thanks, Scott, for the introduction. I'm going to go over a few of the technical things for tonight, just talking a little bit about how we'll be using the Zoom webinar function. For the Q&A portion of the program, towards the end, we'll be using the dedicated Q&A function, not the chat box. By using the Q&A function, we'll better be able to keep track of questions. It also has an upvote function. So if someone posts a question you want to see discussed, be sure to upvote it to help get it to the top of the queue. You can place your questions into the Q&A function at any point during the program, and it'll keep them all there. And as people see them, they can upvote them at any time. Due to the large number of attendees, the chat box will be used only for informational purposes. Throughout the program, I'll be posting relevant links and information there, such as how to buy the book at a 20% discount from the publisher and how to join our mailing list. And you can contact us as presenters if there is any technical difficulty we should know about. If you want to save the chat to retain the links for future use, you can save a transcription by clicking on the 3 dots in the chat window. We're also recording this program, and we will make it available on our website and YouTube channel for viewing later. Finally, I just wanted to note that to some extent, the structure of this particular public program is experimental, both intellectually in its attempt to bring together the expert knowledge of scholars and curators, as Scott mentioned, and technologically in how we accomplish that goal. As many of you have been to our virtual programs before, you'll notice that this looks a little different. And so please bear with us as we navigate this new format, and we would very much appreciate your feedback in the evaluation form at the end of the program. I'll put that in the chat at the end, and it'll also pop up in your browser when you leave the program. So thank you, and I'm now going to turn it over to our Curator of Manuscripts, Ashley Cataldo, who will get the program underway, and I'll join you again later towards the end of the program for the Q&A portion. Ashley?
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley Cataldo, Curator of Manuscripts at AAS. Now that you've had your introduction to AAS and to Zoom, I am going to introduce you to Ben Mutschler, our featured speaker for this evening. Ben is an associate professor of history at Oregon State University. He received his BA from Harvard and actually played music professionally for a period of time after graduating. He then went on to Columbia University, where he received his PhD in American history. Ben has been a fellow at multiple institutions, including the American Antiquarian Society, Massachusetts Historical Society, and the Omohundro Institute. This is Ben's first book, and let me just hold it up here. It's called The Province of Affliction, Illness in the Making of Early New England. So I will turn it over to Ben so he can go over some of the main themes of the book before we go into our discussion and Q&A.
Thanks so much, Ashley, and to Jim and Kayla and Scott as well, and welcoming Scott in his new position. It's been too long since I've been at the American Antiquarian Society in person, but I have very fond feelings of it, and I remember my fellowship there quite well. It's not only a stunning place for its range and depth of its holdings, but also the community that's there, a really kind of creative, congenial bunch, and I miss it. So I'm looking forward to all of us being back in person soon. I want to say a few words to start us off about the project as a whole, a study of illness in everyday life in 18th century New England. Now, in terms of how I got into this, it was not COVID. It began when COVID was not even a twinkle in our eyes. And it began in a kind of interesting way for a project. Often you come to a project, you've got some idea about what you want to do, and you work from the outside in. That is, you locate the materials that will let you sort of execute on that. But this project began from the inside out. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and I was reading through then a range of sources to see what kinds of problems were embedded in those sources that might be explored further. And I noticed that sickness was everywhere in the records of everyday life, in diaries and letters where you might expect it, but also in newspapers and almanacs and court and church records and letters of records of governance at all levels. Now, in some cases, illness appears in a spectacular fashion, as in epidemics, and I hope a little later we may talk a bit about smallpox. I have a chapter on that. But in many other cases, it's sitting there quietly along other kinds of concerns, sometimes in the background, sometimes coming to the fore. And it was that sort of material that I wanted to explore. Now, I wasn't new in finding illness here. There's been many different scholars that have worked with this, and it's a well-known fact of this early modern period that it's riddled with disease, including even in the relatively salubrious New England region that I study. There are histories of medicine and more recently a very rich social history of healing, and I draw on that. But the issue here for me is looking at these entries and where illness is being discussed. Very often it's not talking about therapeutics per se. There's another issue that's afoot that I'll note in a minute. There's also demographic historians that have looked at particularly the illness and its relation to death. And this is a very significant issue. Death rates in this earlier period are quite stunning when we contemplate them, given where they are with us today. And just thinking about infant mortality alone and childhood mortality, really the differences are quite stark. We might expect one infant death for every 24 births. Maybe half, it's been estimated, half of the deaths in total in the period come from children under age 11. And in a place like New England, where, and perhaps we can talk about this later, sometimes the discussion about death is inflated, people may have gone to, even a very small town, 10 to 25 funerals a year. So it was very much there. And yet, the more common problem here, I mean, even if one dies, there's the whole lead up to that. And the more common situation is for people to actually get sick and live. And sometimes very long lives, especially in New England, where people could, if they survived childhood illnesses and then another spate of illnesses in their 20s, easily make it into their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. We'll look at a diary a little later. One of the children from that diary lives into to become 90. There was a kind of episodic rhythm to life in illness, a good chance of falling ill rather than of being ill, this sort of episodic wave of coming into and out of illness. What intrigued me most about the records that I was looking at was that the language was social. In between perfect health and death was a rich array of vocabulary that people used to describe their lives. And much of that had social implications. People talked about being sick and extremely dangerously sick, and sort of inflating. We want to think about what's going on there. But they also use words very commonly like they are indisposed. You know, indisposition suggests that which one has not done. It implies other people, something that you haven't delivered on, perhaps. Or another common expression, that one falls ill. We might take this near literally. People are sick and they almost drop where they are. And they often are away from home in places that maybe they've just been visiting, or perhaps they have an apprenticeship of some sort, or maybe in terms of the laws of poverty, they're not in their town of origin, the town that can claim them and to which they can draw if they've fallen ill. And so we have here a kind of implication of a social world. The image then of these records is of people moving through life and then dropping out for a period of time. And the question is, at what cost? Who gets brought along, and what are the stakes of that? And so the question became, what would our portrait of everyday life look like with illness at its center? How can we better appreciate the defining force of illness, the province of affliction in daily affairs? And I try to show throughout that illness creates a hybrid world where the world of health, of work and industry and striving and muscle and motion are joined together with a very different world of affliction. What is that? Of absence and delay and excuse, of tasks that are done shabbily or maybe left undone altogether. What were the costs of blending those two worlds together? And who was finally responsible? I wind up arguing that sickness both shapes and strains the basic social and governmental institutions of the day. That it was common for the burdens of affliction to become so much for the sick and those around them, for them to reach upward and outward for help. And so sickness became bound up in matters of governance. And then I finally argue that in the wake of the American Revolution, there are efforts to circumscribe the kinds of demands that are emerging from the colonial period that the sick and those charged with their care are making on those governing bodies at all levels. A few words just on the chapters themselves, the section, and then I'll wrap up here. I'll offer a few overviews, including a day that I pick where I look at the ways that affliction is handled in a variety of different places on a single day, in diaries and letters and in government records and so forth. And then there are three sections. The first looks at competency, the ideal that one might have of achieving a middling kind of subsistence for themselves, modest, and it's something that can be passed along, hopefully, through the generations. And so I look at families that are pretty secure in their social moorings and look at the difference between the way families and households handle sickness and the difference between the two that emerges. This is a very blurry sort of area in New England, but illness can kind of expose the difference between family and household. And so I explore that, and we'll be talking a bit about one of the records that I use intensively around that, the Diary of Ebenezer Parkman. And then I have a second section on dependency, the ways in which large forces carry people, threaten them with this dependency, the specter of moving from competency into the realm of the dependent. And those are epidemic and war. And again, we may have a chance to look at smallpox here that I write about. War takes up about half the years leading up to the War of Independence in this period. And it carries forth many young men to strange places where they encounter others for the first time. We might think of a kind of microbial stew there. They get sick, and then their families are left to tend to them in many cases, or to find ways to bring them back home, or to pay for their care while they're on the frontier and in their traveling back home. The final section of the book emphasizes this question of agency. A new emphasis in the wake of the American Revolution that underscores the importance of initiative and ambition, and finally some degree of autonomy that one might enjoy. And I ask, how is it that the plight of the sick could be comprehended within that new regime? I have a chapter on pensions, and I start in the colonial world and look at the disability applications of colonial soldiers ranging through the American Revolution, and the attempts by the federal government to cut back on the kinds of ways that people might have asked these earlier governing bodies to accommodate them. And then I look at the question of poverty and in its relation to sickness, and a new kind of provision in Massachusetts, the state pauper program, which has its origins in the colonial world, but grows, and many people are unhappy with it. Lastly, there's an epilogue that looks at some of the new institutions that are emerging in this associational world of the early national period, charities that deal with sickness, including finally the opening of the doors of the Massachusetts General Hospital in 1821. Well, that's it for me for now. That's the overview, and I'm now handing it back over to Ashley, but I think I keep my camera on, so I'll still be here.
Oopsie. All right, then that was great. So as Kayla mentioned at the beginning of the program, we are trying something new this evening. So before we go into the video that we'll be showing, I just want to tell you what you'll be seeing. This is a silent video of collection materials, either ones that Ben used when he was a fellow at AAS or similar to those Ben used when he was a fellow at AAS. So don't be alarmed if you can't read everything in these videos, or if you can't read anything in these videos. The intention is really to give you the overall impression of what it's like when you first walk into the doors of the society and sit in the reading room and are confronted with a handwritten volume or a handwritten document, and you don't really know what to do with it. So Kayla, if we want to start the first Parkman video. Okay, great. So what you're seeing here is a 1759 diary that was written by Ebenezer Parkman. Parkman was the first minister in Westboro, Massachusetts. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Massachusetts geography, Westboro is about a half-an-hour drive west of Boston. So Parkman was born in 1703, so he was in his mid-50s when he wrote these entries. This is from May of 1759. The remarkable thing about Parkman's diary is that he kept it for 60 years, up until his death in 1782. And many of those diaries still survive, and they are located at the American Antiquarian Society. When researchers look at a volume like this from the 18th century, they tend to notice the very small, very cramped handwriting. And you can see my fingers in this video to get a sense of scale. And oftentimes these diaries from this period were kept in blank volumes, as this one here from Ebenezer Parkman. Sometimes they were kept in almanacs that had blank pages interleaved throughout. So you'd have a printed almanac, a printed page alternating with a blank page. And many diaries from this period are very basic. They will contain information about the weather or about deaths in a community. Parkman's diary is unusual in that it contains so much detail. And that is why it is so important for a historian like Ben, who was trying to understand and write about everyday life in early America. Now we're actually moving to another volume of Parkman's diary from 1769. We're going to be turning to an entry from October 18th of 1769, and we'll zoom in. Again, don't be worried if you can't read anything. But right next to that number 18 at the bottom of the page, Parkman writes about a Mr. Barrett receiving several turns of bleeding. And bleeding was a pretty common medical treatment at the time and throughout the 18th century. But in the same entry, Parkman talks about borrowing a book and dining and preaching. And this diary entry is very representative of what Parkman does throughout the entire diary. He talks about illness and sickness. He talks about sensational events like the hanging of Bathsheba Spooner, who was the first woman elected in the United States. But for the most part, he talks about the daily events in his life. And you can see just from this one entry that illness and sickness and treatment of illness are really just embedded in this entry. And it's visually, I think, representative of, and also within the text, representative of what Ben talks about in his book, which is that illness really was embedded in daily life, just as illness is embedded in this entry and in Parkman's diaries. We can actually go on right to the next video if we want. We're going to be looking at another diary from AAS collections. This is the diary of Ashley Bowen. Bowen was a sailor early in life. He was born in 1728. And we're looking at Bowen's 1777 diary. Ben actually worked with Bowen's 1773 diary. AAS has the 1775 to 77 diary, which is why we're looking at it. And we're looking at entries from April and May of that year of 1777. And you can see that, like Parkman, Bowen kept his diary in a blank book, a very thick, very substantial volume. But unlike Parkman, who embedded information about sickness and treatment in his daily entries, Parkman, in the months of April and May, writes about a smallpox outbreak in Marblehead and lets that outbreak totally overtake all of his entries. Bowen writes about pest houses, about the movement of smallpox through his community. He writes about inoculations, which he actually calls poculation, and also the many deaths that occurred throughout his community. It's unfortunately death after death. And Bowen's diary, I think, Ben, gives you an opportunity to talk about the ways that someone who was living in a port community had to deal with the quarantine of goods and also of people. And you say, and you talk about in the book, the very strict quarantine measures that were put in place in Massachusetts when a smallpox epidemic occurred, and the success that Massachusetts had with quarantine. But Bowen also gives you a chance to talk about the ways that the quarantining activities had a real impact on the local economy. So we can probably, I think this video is coming to an end. We can probably stop it if we wanted to and come back to Ben, because I think what happens, in the Parkman diary, you really make a lot of the social and family networks that came together in Parkman's world to care for the sick and those who had come down with some kind of illness. But in the Bowen diary, there really is, and you make a lot of the smallpox that hit Marblehead in 1773, and the ways that a lot of those family and social networks fell apart when an epidemic like smallpox came into a community. So can you maybe tell us how these diaries came into play in your work, why they were so important to the book, and then tell us about the different ways of treating those who were sick, whether you were in an epidemic or not.
Yeah, these are great questions. The Parkman diary I encountered early on in my travels, and I want to, I was working with it in manuscript and then on film, and it's gorgeous, as you can see here. I'm going to share an image in a moment of just one small entry that gives you an idea of the way I was trying to work with this. But I also wanted to, at the outset, thank Ross Beals, because early on in this process, he shared with me some transcriptions that he had made, and it's just a tremendous amount of work to have done that, and those are now available online after sort of a career of work doing that. So to thank him for that, because some of the ways that I've gone about this really is counted on being able to search through digital copies of these as well. It's the mixture of these two things. And maybe what we could do, Ashley, is I can answer those questions serially and just begin first with the sharing this document, if this will work. This is an exciting Zoom moment, and we'll see if we can do it. Yeah.
Let's see.
All right. Does it look right?
Yeah, this is showing. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, perfect. One never knows in the world of Zoom. Okay. So I'm looking at the 12th here, And let me set the scene, and I'll read just a portion of the 12th that's in front of you at the lower part of your screen. And I'll talk a little bit about what struck me about this kind of entry and how I was trying to handle it. And it's a window onto ways of thinking about the accommodation of illness within families, the possibilities and the strains and so forth. To set the scene, the minister is 55 here, and with his second wife, Hannah Breck Parkman, they are presiding over the parsonage. She's age 43. Between the two marriages, there are 14 children in the family, some of them adults, ranging from age a little over 1 to 34. The three eldest are living in Brookfield, which is a town about 25 miles west as the crow flies. And their youngest is at the parsonage. The three oldest are in Brookfield. And the rest are sort of making their way between and in a few other places, but sort of traveling between the two. Well, let me read this passage from the 12th. You might look at the manuscript as I'm doing it. Parkman writes, "My family much indisposed. My wife has much of her illness remaining, though she's about house. Sarah lies by, Susie has grievous headache, Alexander lame, Sam fever and ague, Hannah very tenfold. Do something in preparing a sermon, but cannot make dispatch by reason of the above said troubles." Sort of cut out a portion of that to get to the end.
Yeah.
So the first thing I want to comment on is the language that Parkman is using here. Note what he's saying about illness and the social implications of it. Somebody that's not able to do what they should be doing. They're lying by, or they're lame, or that his wife is sick, but she's about house. He's registering illness in this way of thinking about labor and performance in a way that he's trying to account for the total capacity of that household. So when I look at a piece like this, there's a way of sort of unpacking what's going on here, sort of narrating the story, both in its particularities and in sort of the larger patterns. Let me just mention a few of those and then back to you, Ashley, on this for our exchange. So first thing to note is that there's a measles epidemic that's part of this. An epidemic swept through New England. It turns smallpox and diphtheria and measles, and they could be quite lethal. The last time measles had appeared in Westboro was 1740, and reports of it in 1759 hit neighboring parishes in early February, and by the end of the month, it was in Westboro. 9 of Parkman's children had been born since then, and so they were vulnerable to getting this. And 7, in the end, do wind up getting the smallpox. And so we can see sort of part of what's going on here is an epidemic, but the only person in this entry who is actually afflicted with measles that's going to break out in a few days is Susie. The other people have different issues going on. So for example, Hannah is 15 months old, an infant, and is so tenfold. She's been sick off and on as a child. And one of the things that I noted about children is they appear in these diaries often when something has gone awry, so it's almost like they live for us, and we see them most brightly in their moments of affliction. And when infants are tenfold and there are other youngsters about, families pursued all sorts of strategies, including boarding out other younger children. So there's a 3.5-year-old that belongs to the family that is boarded out elsewhere. And occasionally there's the strategy of having a tenfold child be weaned and sent out, and then they can be weaned. Then there's others in here that speak to the ways in which affliction plays out in the lives of teens and youths. Susie, who's age 14 here and is going to get measles in a few days, and Sarah, age 16, as young women were participating in this economy of affliction. That is, they could be doing things and helping other healers. They could certainly sit up in the night and watch with the ill. And of course, they're helping beyond that in running households. Here, interestingly, Susie got called back from Brookfield. She'd been helping with her older siblings, and she got brought back because things look like they're starting to unravel a bit at Westboro. And so Parkman summons her to come back and help out with her older sister, Sarah. Sarah's lying by here, but that goes away. And this often happens. Somebody will register something, you're not sure if it's a big deal or not. It sort of appears and disappears. But then in the fall, Sarah is sick for nearly 2 months in September and October. So she too is going to drop out. And with that, and the troubles that Hannah Breck Parkman is having generally, and not having enough labor, the family starts to try to bring in other people, young daughters that can help, that are neighbors that can be brought in. Eventually, in cases like this, families might even hire out somebody to bring in. So they enter into the market economy for it. Alexander, age 12 here, is lame, and he's had an accident with an axe. And when you read the diary, you see again and again young children starting to participate in various sorts of labors, and then they can have accidents or other illnesses. And here, there's many cases of people being around his age, he's 12, where they are getting used to things and they injure themselves. In the later teens, as Parkman's sons are working on the farm, this is a great thing. But when they get ill, then again, he's in trouble in the same way when his older daughters get ill, and he may have to hire out help. And that happens in 1755 with him as he scrambles to try to get the crops in. And the last thing to mention here from all of this, and coming back to you, just an entry like this, is that when young men are getting sick here, we often find, well, let me rephrase that. There's a way in which the family is stretching beyond the bounds of the house. They're responsible for those children and even adult children when they go somewhere else and they fall ill. Maybe wherever they're sick, the people there will take care of them, but eventually this is no longer sustainable. And a good example of this kind of thing is Thomas Parkman. The year ends with his son dying. He has signed up to be part of the 7 Years' War and the campaign there. And it's on the heels of him trying several different apprenticeships that don't work. He keeps getting ill at them. He's otherwise indisposed, and Parkman needs to reclaim him. He finally goes off, and then he dies. And Parkman spends next months dealing with the fallout of that, trying to pay whatever's necessary for the care for son Thomas. And then also, and poignantly, there's a fellow soldier that writes Parkman and says, "We buried Thomas in a shirt of mine, and he needs to have that paid for." And this goes on and on and on afterwards. And so part of something like this might even be suggesting the world well beyond the house itself, where family has this obligation. So I'll stop with that. It's just one way I wanted folks to be able to actually read some of this and get us launched there.
And Ben, can you just tell us about what happens when the epidemic like smallpox comes into a community, and a place like Marblehead, which you talk about, smallpox entering in 1773, and maybe briefly the quarantine measures and the success with quarantine measures that Massachusetts put into place.
Yeah, the most remarkable thing about smallpox is it's pretty much universally considered as contagious. There's a debate about many other kinds of diseases that are swirling about, so-called, other kinds of infectious diseases. Because of that, the kinds of relationships that have developed, both in terms of labor and the work of trying to help people heal, all of those become dangerous. The society gathers around the sick. They watch with them through the night. They visit and so forth. They help out where they can. And suddenly, once contagion is there, all those kinds of things might be lethal. And so I explore that dynamic where the everyday kinds of institutions are starting to unravel, and where things that you would count on. We have a consumer revolution that's underway in 1773. It's intensifying. Where goods themselves are seen to be quite dangerous. And so they have to sort of flip on this. They are capable in this world of moving into and out of this idea of things being, on the one hand, necessary and desirable, and sort of social relations around that. And then very quickly, when contagion strikes, in the case of smallpox, for example, think of those things as possibly lethal. So that's one sort of issue there. Now, how the town handles this is very interesting. New England really takes matters of public health seriously from the outset. Puritans that had experienced plague in England are determined to do something more vigorous in their public health measures. And from the 17th century forward, there are provisions for isolation of sick people and goods, cleansing measures, things that by the 18th century are really becoming elaborated through the general court, a whole variety of provisions there. And so, for example, in Marblehead, when there's word that there is smallpox in Boston, they put up a fence and a gate that keeps people from coming in to the city. Bowen himself agrees to man this. When people do come in, they are smoked, and they have they're with a sulfur kind of smoke that's thought to cleanse of the possibility of smallpox adhering in that clothing. If a house is stricken with smallpox, and there's less than 20 families that are stricken with it, it's made to notify the selectmen right away, hang out a red flag on a 6-foot pole to let everybody know who's sick there. And then there are guards that are put around the house to make sure that people don't go in and out, and fences and this sort of thing. The selectmen assume enormous powers during this. And I play with this or explore this in the chapter and thinking about, how far can this go? This is quite sort of potent stuff to be told you need to stay in your house, and there'll be a fence around it, and there's no leaving, and there's extreme penalties, financial or even corporeal punishment for violating these sorts of things. How do people react? And on the whole, while there's all sorts of little infractions, you see people behaving themselves, doing what they're supposed to do here. And they're so successful with this that people could go and not be exposed to some of these infectious diseases like smallpox. So Parkman's, this is sort of a complicated relation, we could talk later if you wanted to, but it's his second wife's prior husband's mother. He calls her Mother Shaw, but she gets sick. She's 79 years old, and she's never had smallpox. This is a remarkable kind of achievement, right? To have somebody be able to go through, because smallpox is endemic in England and elsewhere in Europe. But through these kinds of measures that are coercive in many ways, New Englanders are able to fend it off.
Great. Thank you, Ben. So I think maybe we'll go into the next and the final video that we have of collection material, and hopefully we'll have enough time for Q&A at the end of the program. So we're starting out here. AAS, as you may know, has an incredible collection of newspapers. Actually, the best collection of early American newspapers in the whole world. What you're seeing here are advertisements from some Massachusetts and Rhode Island papers that mention enslaved Blacks who had had smallpox and who escaped from those who claimed to own them. As you mentioned in the book, Ben, enslaved people who already had the disease were appealing to slave owners because they could go out into the community and not bring an infection back home. Also, you might be able to see in these ads, smallpox scars unfortunately made enslaved Blacks more identifiable. We also, in a few minutes, will see reports of hospitalizations and numbers, both Black and white, of those who died from smallpox. And although you don't talk about these advertisements and articles directly in the book, the story of enslaved and free Blacks is part of a much more complicated piece of your book. We read in the book that free Blacks would often be required to clean streets during epidemics, and also that free Blacks often appeared in the state pauper rolls, those that you mentioned a little bit earlier tonight. And also that they were affected by the laws that then came to govern Massachusetts and the treatment of the poor in Massachusetts. Also, these articles gesture toward another smaller issue in your book, which is who was deemed responsible for the sickness in the body of an enslaved person or an indentured servant. Did the slave owner who claimed to own the body also own and was responsible for the illness? In a moment, we'll transition in this video to a list of soldiers, here it comes, who were sent home in 1781 for various illnesses and disabilities. Ben and I actually did a bit of investigative work yesterday and determined that this this document is actually a copy of an original that was sent to George Washington in 1782. This document is from AAS's United States Revolution collection, and oftentimes scholars will work with this collection to get at some of the big names like Washington and Hamilton and Lafayette. But you, Ben, used this collection very differently. You used it to talk about the sick and those who were dealing with disabilities. A discussion of this list and other materials in the that you talk about in the book launch you into a discussion of things like the Invalid Corps, which was a group of soldiers like these men who were not physically capable of fighting, but were assigned other duties like guarding those pest houses that you just talked about. And also the petitions for pensions, which you mentioned at the beginning of the program, which you say go back as far as the late 17th century in Massachusetts. And also you talk about who the state and then much later the federal government deemed worthy of pensions. I know these are all part of very complicated parts of your book, but can you elaborate on, and I know we want to leave time for questions, but can you elaborate on how, whether you were an impoverished free Black in Massachusetts or a pensioner, how the community and the state dealt with those financial burdens of caring for the sick? And I know you could talk for an hour just about pensions alone.
Yeah. Well, maybe I could start with the pensions. Let me ask this. I'm sorry for
Yeah.
the question, but I did get to just see one thing pop up on the Q&A.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, my sound is a problem. Is it any better now? I'll try to see if I can really belt it out, and I changed microphone. Is that any better?
I wasn't having trouble, Ben, but it might be a little bit clearer. I did see that comment.
Ben, it is better. Yes.
I'll try to pretend that I'm, talking in a room of 200. Here we go. And I'm sorry about that, people.
Okay.
So, on pensions, what I do is I start in the colonial period, and these are never large numbers of people, but it really is one way of thinking about the history of disability and a kind of durable topic in the history of disability. And pensions are one thing. The possibility of an invalid pension is something that can entice people into signing up, if they're going to get injured. Most of the pensioners are, people that are applying because of an injury. But I argue, the grounds for asking for a pension expand quite a bit. People are talking about illness, and they're talking about things that happened to them many years earlier, sometimes decades earlier. And we see in their petitions to the general court a kind of expansiveness as they describe being in battle and stepping in a cold river, and it's sort of shocking their constitution, and maybe they recover for a bit, but then, they're back to having trouble some years later. With the, sort of adhering to the monarchical form of political culture, head down and hand out, spill their guts in petitions, and they come humbly, and but then they ask to be commiserated, and that means effectively paid. They have to apply again and again, and it takes a while, but we have steadily the grounds expanding and increasing during the 70s. And then just to finish this part up, what happens is a real pushback at the federal level, where the Secretary of War, Henry Knox, devises criteria for what he calls decisive disability. This criteria isn't based on some sort of new medical understanding, but Knox says effectively this. First of all, we need to have pensioners basically have their cases accommodated locally. He wants to do that as much as possible so as not to mire the federal government in all sorts of claims. But in terms of the way this is proceeding in Massachusetts and the sort of the expanding grounds for asking, Knox is really worried about that kind of thing. This can go on ad infinitum. And so what he does is, with decisive disability, he says you can only get a pension for a known wound, from back. And so that means if you become sick, there's no, you're out of luck, and people apply based on these earlier grounds and they get denied from the War Office. And it even is this perverse kind of thing to contemplate. Somebody could have been blinded by a musket ball in the eye, or they could have been blinded by smallpox, and they're going to get compensated for the musket ball in the eye, but not for sickness. So he's sort of trying to strip away this earlier way of presenting a kind of integrated and expansive sense of malaise and how one present that to governors of all sorts. So that's on pensions. I know we're looking for sort of time. Do you want, should we turn it to questions, or do you want me to try to address your other part about state paupers and so forth?
Kayla, what are you thinking? We should probably go to the Q&A maybe, and maybe the state pauper question will come up in the context of the questions from the audience.
Yeah, maybe Ben, if you want to take just 1 minute, quickly do an overview while people, I just sent a reminder in the chat for people to put their questions in. So maybe just take a minute while people finish doing that, and then we'll move.
Okay, that would be great.
That sounds good. Well, poverty, the poor laws are offered on a sort of two-tiered basis. One is that there's this elegant idea that everybody that has a legal place of settlement, that town is responsible for them. That's in some ways that's more than we even have today.
Yep.
The problem happens with that local poor law provision initially is that you often get sick and you're not in your town, and so then there's this struggle to figure out who's going to pay for that, and because the ways that people need to be treated call for some degree of immediacy, but the schedule goes much slower, and so towns battle each other, and towns maybe lean on families, and it gets to be sort of this contest to sort out who's finally responsible. Happens also during this period, and it starts off with Boston, and it's much less frequent elsewhere, and then it really picks up after the Revolution in the state pauper program, building on the Province Poor program, is the idea that if people don't have a legal settlement anywhere, they can be put on these state poor rolls. And for a complicated set of reasons, including the law of inhabitancy, including particular regulations pertaining to free blacks that make it harder for them to secure an inhabitancy, more likely for them to be moved from place to place, harder to secure any kind of sort of independency in their living, they wind up filling the roles of the state poor along with many others, the elderly and infirm, for example, chronic sorts of illness here is featured there. And that state pauper program, more and more towns avail themselves of, and they will even have a kind of incentive to put people on the state rolls, because that means their local town won't have to pay for this.
Yeah.
As it grows, and eventually what I try to say is that it becomes the emblem of what's wrong with public relief, and people that champion the hospital and other kinds of medical charities point to the state pauper program and say it's spare sorts of ways of handling people and their sicknesses.
Yeah.
We need some other kind of more generous provision and something that will help somebody that's virtuous and ambitious get back on their feet.
Yes.
Away from family and can't be cared for. So, all right, let me stop with that. I can't read and see if questions are coming in. Over to you, Kayla.
All right. Yes, we have several questions in the queue, and I'll just kind of go through. People are also upvoting, which is great, so we can kind of get a sense of what people are interested in hearing about. So the first question is from Beth Louie, and she asked, did the statistics gathered include the illnesses and deaths of Native people? If so, were they kept separately? And this is interesting also in terms of some of the newspaper articles that we just looked at, because we saw some of those stats separately for Blacks, right? So can you answer that about Indigenous populations as well?
This is a complicated, because often in legal provision, so-called Negroes and Indians and mulattoes are lumped together, and it's hard to know in the time when they're counting. Many of these early bills of mortality, and you may have seen, I don't know if the question comes from seeing one of those, lists whites and blacks, but to be black it's a capacious term here, so it's hard to know exactly who that's catching, and that gets more complicated over time as natives and free blacks form unions in early national Massachusetts. So that's a hard one to answer in any way decisively, but the counting, it is interesting from early on that whites and blacks are being separated and counted separately. It's starting very early on in the 18th century. Some people have speculated initially this is in part a way of trying to evaluate slave labor, for example, and trying to think about would there be other sorts of systems of labor in New England that might be cheaper. And so there's sort of people are counting out how much it costs when somebody is enslaved dies from something like smallpox. So a kind of grim exercise.
The next question is from Angela Ray, and she asks, can you explain how scholars of medical history use archival materials to quote unquote diagnose illnesses that were understood only later on, such as viral diseases? How can we make plausible claims about what was wrong with people in the past?
It's a really good question. In the history of medicine, if you reach back many decades, initially there was a kind of craze for what came to be called retrodiagnosis, right? It's trying to figure out what was that really? And do we have a name for it? It sounds like it's, XYZ disease that we know today. And then subsequent to that, historians really complicated this because, first of all, for somebody to call something a disease from the time period doesn't mean that it's the same disease. Disease changes over time, and their conception of what would have been that particular disease may have been quite different than ours. And you think about even changes of something like tuberculosis, right? That starts off as consumption and becomes tuberculosis over time. So this is very difficult to do. And I think there was a sort of leaving aside in a certain way any great attempt to retrodiagnose lots of conditions, because in some ways it was taking away from understanding how people at the time were thinking about these diseases. They don't have that language. They don't have our conceptual framework. That said, if one knows something about the natural course of any given disease, say smallpox, which finally gets eliminated in the 20th century, but there's a lot of sort of studies on that, there's a way of at least speculating. Well, we know that its course typically is around 30 days, maybe a little bit more. And with that in mind, you can find sort of patterns, perhaps in the earlier period, just assuming that if smallpox at the time obeyed the rules that we know later on, maybe we can figure out something about this puzzle of how it's playing out in the community or something like that. I guess that's an answer. I think I took the question to be sort of wondering how we could do this. And I think in the history of medicine, there's been a movement away from certainly a continuous ongoing retrodiagnosis kind of perspective. It's moved elsewhere. Different kinds of contexts are most interesting these days.
Sure. All right, the next question is from Mark Sturgis, and he asks, I'm curious about whether or not shifting social attitudes on the eve of the American Revolution changed public compliance with government mandated quarantines and other measures. In other words, as many Massachusetts colonists began to rebel against British economic oversight, did they also resist public health measures?
Yeah. This is a really good question. Whoops, is that me echoing somewhere? I'm not sure, sorry.
You're okay. Nope, you're good.
Good, you'll keep me on task here. There's a really nice work on there's an episode, as it turns out, in Marblehead that sort of speaks to this exact question. And it happens after I trace an outbreak that doesn't consume the whole town, but still sort of shows the stakes of this and what it means to have social relations of contagion and how the town is getting involved and so forth. In 1773, starting in June, and I follow this family and their woes, the Bowens, in July. But later on, Marblehead has in 1774 a riot around a question of inoculation. And in brief, there is a smallpox hospital that's built essentially with private funds, and the town sort of feels maybe bamboozled into having agreed to it. And there's an effort to try to not have the project go forward. And eventually it's constructed on Cat Island. And the critique of this is that elite people are going to it. And most important with this, because they have the means, it's expensive in this private regime to pay for it. Most important that it's some kind of violation of the community contract. That is, if only a few people can get inoculated here, what about the rest of them, and particularly what happens with inoculation, which is the intentional infection using infected matter that you introduce, usually through a slice in the arm or a leg, and you get a hopefully much lesser case of smallpox, and then you can have lifelong immunity. In the case of inoculation, the community violation is that you still, after getting inoculated, can be contagious to other people. And the worry is, what if you get that done and then you don't behave yourself and remain confined? What if you get back to your fields or your shipping or whatever else it is? And so there's a real concern that it's going to actually increase the outbreaks in the community. So this is a long-winded way of saying there's a riot, which looks very much like other kinds of mob actions from this period. You think about the mob actions related to, say, the Stamp Act and the Stamp Act collectors and so forth. It looks much like that, and it follows the rituals of the mob, their sort of defense of liberty, and the claim that they're acting on the good of the whole of the people. And then this directed action. You don't like the Stamp Act, well, go after the Stamp Act collector, right? And intimidate them. You don't like inoculation? Well, maybe row out to the hospital and do what they did, which is they burned it down. Now, the interesting thing here is, and sorry, I'll finish with this, I realize I'm going on it, is that, people did not seem to be objecting to the restrictions around quarantine itself. It was really a different set of issues that were upsetting people. The inequity of having just a few elite people being able to avail themselves of inoculation, the insult on the community as a whole, the lack of the town meeting, being as involved as it might, and in all of these sorts of corporatist ways, people are still valuing that. And in fact, after this happens a few years later, from the diary that Ashley first read from in 1777, there's inoculation, and it proceeds much more in the way of trying to provide for everybody. There's different strategies for that, and getting the agreement of the town, and that goes off without a hitch. And Ashley Bowen, who is somebody who's very critical, as Ashley was saying, of this pox hospital, he calls, and the people that are taking in he calls them the inoculation gentry. He's very wry and critical. He seems to be fine with this, and he has his children inoculated. There's some really good work on this. There's a wonderful article by Andrew Wehrman that writes about this particular riot. And there's been many historians that have actually looked at this episode. So.
All right. We're getting a little close to time, but I think, we'll go just a little bit over. I want to take a couple more questions. The next one is from Jerry Rosenthal, asking, given the strict religious beliefs of many 18th century New Englanders, do the records contain statements that an illness was sent by God due to the sufferer's moral shortcomings? And this may be particularly interesting given Parkman.
Yeah, that's right. Well, there's a change in tenor over time, but there is a very common kind of refrain, a providential refrain, trying to understand the purpose of illness, how one's supposed to react to it. And it changes over time, but this overall sense that illness can be a chance for self-examination, for repentance and renewal, to let go of things of the temporal world, a kind of correction. In the 17th century, Anne Bradstreet writes about that God strikes and it's a correction, and she actually desires that. She feels like she sits loose from God, and being smitten in a way reminds her of what's most important, the drama of the soul, as opposed to getting caught up in everyday life sorts of issues. And also we have somebody like Cotton Mather, who writes in this sort of densely metaphoric way. It's a wonderful phrase from Robert Blair St. George, who talks about this kind of idea. Mather talks about, that you cough up sin, for example, right? And prayer is the best emetic. The notion that you would pray and that's going to actually sort of cleanse the body and help restore it to health. This sort of thing is common early on. That densely metaphoric world sort of starts to loosen up a bit over the 18th century, but you do find again and again, even people that don't really reflect on God's providence in other kinds of entries, when they're really up against it, you see that appear. And so it's a very prominent theme from the period. And my sense of this, just a last comment on it, is I really admire the sense of purpose that seems to give to people. This, what do you do when all of this is happening? When you have the terror that your child might die or that you might die, when you really don't know whether something that seems to be pretty innocuous might escalate very quickly into something lethal. That happens again. This is part of their terror about illness, that possibility. It doesn't happen all the time, but that it could happen. And there's something there about people turning at that moment to sort of think about what is their purpose there, and how can this be a chance to let go in some ways, and be a chance for self-reflection that I've found intriguing and moving.
Absolutely. The next question has to do with women's work. So, you talked in that entry in Parkman's diary about his daughters and them getting called back. So this seems very relevant. And thinking a little further about that, how much of women's work was devoted to illness? This is coming from Tamara Thornton. And she says, I'm thinking concretely of the bathing and laundering that must become necessary with fevers, etc., and just dealing with bodily fluids. Could women keep up with it? Was it only women dealing with this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Women are absolutely central to caregiving in the period, which gets incorporated into the domestic economy. And that remains to this period and into the 19th century. You think of somebody like Catherine Beecher and her treatise on domestic economy, and how much of that is just trying to train people about healing and how to keep a fresh, hygienic household and well ventilated and all this kind of stuff. My way of looking at this, although my book isn't really particularly about therapeutics, so this sort of appears on the edges of it more than centrally, is that what I notice is a few things. First of all, when adult women of the house get sick, if it's a wife or if it's an elder daughter that's helping run that domestic economy, people get concerned quickly because it does become difficult to have things continue on. And that economy is one of immediacy, a perishable economy, right? I mean, it's how one gets fed, and it's day-to-day tasks, and it's things that are not going to be able to be held over for very long. And so you see that kind of issue emerged, and it points to, and this is something I try to emphasize, the importance then of women in achieving the ideal of competency, which we see through not only their ability to handle sickness itself, and that's to the person's question. Yes, they're centrally involved in that as healers, as watchers, as people tending in all sorts of ways to the sick, and that continues on. And well, we could talk about that further if we wanted to, sort of tradition of mothers handing down daughters recipes that deal with the curing of diseases or the treatment and so forth. But what I emphasize is that when a young woman or the mother of a house gets sick, it really points out all of their missing labor and the way that is absolutely central to sustaining a competency. And you really don't see, in many cases, diarists or others commenting on it until that point. And then, boy, everything is really busting up and so that's at least one swipe at that question. I think it's a really good one.
Yeah. All right, I think this will be our last question, but I want to let people know that I will put Ben's email in the chat. He's happy to take further questions from anyone who wasn't able to get their question answered live, so feel free to contact him there. So the last question is from Caroline Allison, and she asks, what connections do you see between the 19th century reform movements, such as for mental health, for the poor, disabled, etc., and the period that you researched? Also, what is the origin of the phrase that you use for your title, which is a fitting way to end, I think.
Well, there's a move towards greater reliance on institutions to try to move some of these things out from communities. We haven't talked about madness, and I actually don't write very much about that. There's some great ongoing work that's there, looking at madness in New England in the pre-asylum era. But the construction, the kind of confident construction of asylums and then state hospitals and other kinds of things are a product of the 19th century. And I try to end the book gesturing towards the logic that's fueling that. And part of that on the charitable end, thinking about, say, the Massachusetts General Hospital, is this is the only way with a kind of public-private relationship that's funding the hospital through its incorporation and various kinds of privileges it's given. That the hospital, the people arguing for that say these other kinds of provisions are just not enough. That local poor laws are not doing it, state poor laws are not doing it. And what we owe people that are ambitious and doing what we want them to do, sort of seizing their destiny in the wake of the revolution, we need something to help them out if they are apart from family, if they're alone, if they're stricken, because they're otherwise going to fail in some significant way, perhaps die, perhaps become a public charge. And so we see in the 19th century this kind of commentary about the 18th century and earlier that can be critical and suggest that the institutions may ameliorate situations better. But I try to say that these institutions also fail on the same grounds. They get overwhelmed in all sorts of ways. And that there's something that's lost there from that earlier world where people are talking about illness all the time, the stakes of it, recognizing the labor that's involved in it, understanding the sacrifice that's necessary to tend it, including, as we were saying, sort of public health measures, but beyond that, think about the idea of watching with your neighbor through the night and what's required, this kind of thing. And I try to say that these problems of sickness overwhelming the institutions that try to help with it in the 18th century continues on in the 19th century, even with these newfangled sorts of asylums and other things that are devised to contain its rages. So on the Province of Affliction, on the title, it's meant to be sort of the hold of sickness in everyday life, the province in that way. It's a play on this also because I focus mostly on Massachusetts. And the reason for that is I really was interested in trying to understand territorial boundaries, especially in poor law provision. It matters if you are on the border of Massachusetts and another state and when people are coming in and what you do about that. So there's that sort of issue. And then finally, and this is sort of complicated, I talk about the Province of Affliction in the sort of blended aesthetics that I mentioned at the beginning of work and striving and muscle and motion on the one hand, and then people falling out, right? Absence and delay and excuse. And I call that the province as a kind of metaphor, thinking about cultural provinces in this period, that lay just outside a metropolitan area. We have an art history this and thinking, and Bernard Balin writes about this in terms of politics, the kind of creativity that happens in these places that are not at the center of it, but they're just close enough to see it. And I have the Province of Affliction. I try to come back to this theme. I think of the metropole as being health, and the Province of Affliction can kind of see it in the distance, but they're living somewhere else. And they're having to compromise and act creatively in that province in order to address everybody's needs. So that's where that comes from.
That's great. Well, thank you, Ben, and thank you, Ashley, for a fantastic program. And I have put several things in the chat for people who will be interested in either contacting Ben, filling out the evaluation. And this will conclude our virtual public programs for the year, but keep an eye out for upcoming ones in the new year. So thank you both, and I look forward to future programs.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben.